The blood-red sunrise painted the sky as Zara Jenkins clutched her father's pocket watch, the only memento she had left of him, and stared at the blackened remains of her family's ranch house. Montana Territory, 1878, was no place for a woman alone, but Zara had nowhere else to go and no one left to turn to. She squared her shoulders, wiped away a solitary tear before anyone could see it, and marched toward the barn, the only structure the raiders had left standing. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her blue eyes sharp with determination despite the hollowness behind them. At 22, she had already endured more than most people faced in a lifetime. "You planning on staying out here all by yourself, Miss Jenkins?" Sheriff Miller called as he mounted his horse, preparing to leave after investigating the attack. "I'll manage just fine," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands that she concealed by clutching her skirts. "My father built this place from nothing. I won't abandon it." The sheriff shook his head. "Them Blackwater gang boys might come back. Ain't safe for a woman alone." "Then I'll be ready for them," she said, lifting her chin. Sheriff Miller sighed. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Zara truly alone for the first time since the attack 3 days ago. Once he disappeared over the ridge, Zara's shoulders slumped. She made her way to the barn, climbed up to the loft, and finally allowed herself to collapse into the hay. Her body shook with silent sobs as she curled into herself, clutching her father's watch. Her mother had died years ago from consumption, and now her father and younger brother were gone too, killed by outlaws who'd wanted their land and cattle. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly at the barn door. In an instant, Zara wiped her face, straightened her dress, and grabbed the shotgun leaning against the hay bale. She positioned herself at the edge of the loft, aiming down at the barn entrance. "Come out slow with your hands where I can see them," she called, proud that her voice didn't waver. "Don't shoot, madam," a deep voice replied. "Name's Hayes Montague. I'm looking for work. Heard the Jenkins place might be hiring." "You heard wrong," Zara called back. "Mr. Jenkins is dead and I'm not hiring." There was a pause. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, madam. I met your pa once in town. He was a good man." The sincerity in his voice made Zara hesitate. Slowly, she descended the ladder, keeping the shotgun trained on the barn door. Hayes Montague was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days in the saddle. His dark brown hair was in need of a trim, and a stubble shadowed his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Zara's attention, deep green and surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "You're too late for the funeral," she said flatly. "And like I said, I'm not hiring." Hayes nodded, his hat in his hands. "I understand. But if you don't mind me saying, miss, this is an awful lot of ranch for one person to manage." "I'll manage just fine," Zara repeated, the same words she'd said to the sheriff. Hayes looked around, his experienced eyes taking in the condition of the barn, the tools, the few remaining horses. "Raiders took most of your stock." Zara's finger tightened on the trigger. "How did you know about the raiders?" He raised his hand slightly. "Word travels. I heard in town that the Blackwater gang hit a ranch out this way. Didn't know it was yours until just now." She lowered the shotgun slightly but kept it ready. "Well, now you know. And as you can see, there's nothing for you here." "Maybe not," Hayes said slowly, "but there's something I can do for you. I don't need charity." "Not offering any, madam. I'm offering fair work for fair pay when you can pay it. I need somewhere to stay and you need help rebuilding." "Seems like a reasonable arrangement to me." Zara wanted to refuse. She'd promised herself she wouldn't rely on anyone ever again, but the reality of her situation was impossible to ignore. The cattle were gone, the house burned, and winter would come before she knew it. 1 week, she finally said. You can stay 1 week. There's a bunkhouse behind where the main house used to be. It's small, but it's still standing. You can sleep there. Hayes nodded, replacing his hat. Yes, madam, thank you, madam. And stop calling me madam. My name is Zara. Yes, ma, Miss Zara. She turned away so he wouldn't see the ghost of a smile that threatened to break through her carefully constructed facade. First light tomorrow, Mr. Montague. We start rebuilding the chicken coop. Hayes, he corrected gently, if I'm calling you Zara. She nodded curtly and walked away, her back straight as a ramrod, pretending she didn't feel his eyes following her. The next morning, Zara woke before dawn, dressed quickly in her most practical skirt and blouse, and headed out to the remains of the chicken coop. To her surprise, Hayes was already there, sorting through the debris and salvaging what could be reused. Morning, he said, tipping his hat. Hope you don't mind me getting started early. Zara shook her head, momentarily thrown off balance by his initiative. Not at all. They worked side by side in silence for the first hour, Zara stubbornly taking on tasks that would normally require a man's strength. When a heavy beam slipped and nearly crushed her foot, Hayes moved quickly, catching it before it could fall. I had it, she snapped, embarrassed by her carelessness. Course you did, he replied easily, no hint of condescension in his tone. Just lending a hand. By midday, the framework of the new coop was taking shape. Zara wiped sweat from her brow and looked at their progress with satisfaction. You hungry? Hayes asked. I caught some fish in the creek this morning before you were up. Thought we might cook them for lunch. Zara's stomach growled in response. She hadn't had a proper meal in days, subsisting on hardtack and jerky. That would be nice. Hayes built a small fire and set about preparing the fish while Zara fetched water from the well. As they sat eating, Zara found herself studying the cowboy covertly. His hands were calloused but moved with surprising grace. He ate neatly, without the slovenly manners so many ranch hands displayed. Where are you from, Mr. Montague? She asked, breaking the silence. Hayes, he reminded her. Originally from Texas. My pa had a small spread there, but it wasn't enough for 3 sons. I've been drifting north for a few years now, working where I can. And what brought you to Montana territory? He shrugged. Heard there was good land out here. Was saving up to maybe stake a claim someday. Was. Hayes looked at her directly, his green eyes serious. Money has a way of disappearing when you need it most. Had to use my savings to help my brother's family when their place flooded last spring. Zara nodded, understanding all too well how quickly fortunes could change. That was good of you. It's what family does, he said simply. The words cut deep. Family. Zara had none left. Hayes must have noticed the change in her expression because he quickly changed the subject. Those raiders, they take anything besides the cattle. Zara's hand went automatically to her pocket where her father's watch resided. Everything of value. Money, jewelry, silver. She swallowed hard. They even took my mother's wedding ring from my father's body. Hayes' jaw tightened. The Blackwater gang has been causing trouble across 3 territories. Law can't seem to catch up to them. The law isn't trying hard enough, Zara said bitterly. Some things a person has to handle themselves, Hayes replied, his voice carrying an edge that made Zara look at him sharply. You sound like you have experience with that. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Let's just say I understand what it means to lose family to men who think they can take whatever they want. Something passed between them, then a recognition, a shared understanding that went beyond words. For the first time since her father's death, Zara felt slightly less alone. The days fell into a rhythm. They rebuilt the chicken coop, then started on repairs to the barn. Hayes proved himself to be skilled with his hands and unafraid of hard work. He never complained about the meager meals or the long hours, and he never pushed Zara to talk about her feelings. But sometimes, she felt his eyes on her when she thought she was alone, when she paused in her work to stare at the charred remains of her home, or when she stood at her family's fresh graves on the hill behind the property. One evening, about 5 days after Hayes' arrival, Zara was preparing a stew with vegetables from the garden that had somehow survived the raid. Hayes came in from tending to the horses, bringing with him the scent of hay and leather. "Something smells good," he said, washing his hands in the basin by the door of the small kitchen that adjoined the bunkhouse. "Just a simple stew," Zara replied. "We'll need to go to town soon for supplies. We're running low on flour and coffee." Hayes nodded. "I can ride in tomorrow if you'd like." "We'll both go," Zara said firmly. "I need to speak with the bank about a loan to buy new cattle." Hayes looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving, a little bird with delicate wings. "Made this while watching the horses," he said, holding it out to her. "Noticed you watching the bluebirds yesterday." Zara took the carving, surprised by the gesture and the skill it displayed. The bird was small enough to fit in her palm but detailed enough to recognize the species. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I didn't know you could carve." Hayes shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "My grandfather taught me, said idle hands were the devil's workshop." "Your hands have been anything but idle since you arrived," Zara observed. "I don't know how I would have managed without your help this week." "Does that mean I can stay longer?" he asked, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Zara hesitated. Having Hayes around made things easier, but it also made her vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety. She'd caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to the horses, the gentleness in his hands despite their strength. "Yes," she finally said, "you can stay, but we need to discuss payment." "I can't pay you much until we get the ranch running again, but room and board is enough for now," Hayes interrupted. "Once we get some cattle and the place is producing again, we can talk about wages." Zara frowned. "That could be months. You can't work for nothing." "I'm not working for nothing," Hayes said quietly. "I'm working for something that matters." The next day, they rode into town together. Zara wore her best remaining dress, a blue calico that brought out her eyes, and had her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. She was acutely aware of Hayes riding beside her, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. Twin Pines was a small settlement, consisting of a main street with the essential businesses: general store, saloon, blacksmith, bank, and sheriff's office. As they rode in, Zara noticed people watching them, whispering behind their hands. "Don't pay them any mind," Hayes said quietly. "Small towns run on gossip." "I'm used to it," Zara replied, though the scrutiny still made her uncomfortable. Since her father's death, she'd been the subject of much speculation. A young, unmarried woman trying to run a ranch on her own was practically scandalous. They tied their horses outside the general store, and Hayes helped Zara down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The contact was brief but left Zara feeling flustered. "I'll see to the supplies," Hayes offered. "You go on to the bank." Zara nodded, grateful for the chance to compose herself. She made her way to the bank, steeling herself for what was sure to be an unpleasant conversation. As expected, Mr. Patterson, the bank manager, was less than encouraging. "I'm afraid I can't approve a loan of that size, Miss Jenkins," he said, peering at her over his spectacles. "Without a man to run the ranch, it's simply too risky an investment." Zara felt her cheeks flush with anger. "I've been running that ranch alongside my father for years, Mr. Patterson. I know every aspect of the business." "Be that as it may," Patterson replied, A woman alone cannot be expected to manage such an enterprise successfully. Perhaps you should consider selling the property. I know several gentlemen who would be interested in acquiring it. I'm not selling, Zara said firmly. And I'm not alone. I've hired a foreman, Mr. Hayes Montague. Patterson's eyebrows rose. The drifter, Miss Jenkins, that hardly improves your situation. The man has no roots in this community, no stake in your success. Zara stood, gathering her dignity around her like armor. Mr. Montague has shown more integrity and work ethic in 1 week than many men in this town have demonstrated in years. Good day, Mr. Patterson. She turned and walked out, her back straight despite the crushing disappointment. Without a loan, she couldn't restock the herd. Without cattle, the ranch couldn't produce income. Without income, she would eventually lose everything her father had built. Hayes was waiting outside the bank, having finished with the supplies. One look at her face told him all he needed to know. "No luck?" he asked quietly. Zara shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. "Come on," Hayes said, placing a gentle hand at the small of her back. "Let's get something to eat before we head back. Things always look clearer on a full stomach." He guided her to the small cafe at the end of the street. As they walked, Zara noticed 3 rough-looking men watching them from in front of the saloon. Something about their scrutiny made her uneasy. "Hayes," she murmured, nodding slightly in their direction. Hayes glanced over, his posture changing subtly. "Keep walking," he said, his voice low. "Don't look at them again." Inside the cafe, they found a table near the back. Zara removed her bonnet, her hands shaking slightly. "Who were those men?" she asked. Hayes' expression was grim. "Trouble. I recognize one of them rode with the Blackwater gang for a while." Zara's heart began to pound. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. They probably came to town to spend some of what they stole from you and others." Anger flared hot in Zara's chest. "We should tell the sheriff." "And say what?" "That we recognize a man we've never met before, that we think he might be part of a gang." Hayes shook his head. "Sheriff needs more than that to act, so they just get away with it. With murdering my father and brother, with taking everything I had." Hayes reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, reassuring. "No, they don't, but we need to be smart about this." The waitress came over and they ordered coffee and stew. As they ate, Hayes outlined a plan. They would follow the men when they left town, track them back to their camp, and then bring the sheriff with proof of their identities and crimes. "It's dangerous," Zara said. "Which is why you'll stay back while I scout their camp," Hayes replied. Zara's eyes flashed. "This is my fight too." "I'm coming with you." "Zara, no," she interrupted. "I won't be left behind. These men killed my family. I have every right to help bring them to justice." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you follow my lead, understand? These men won't hesitate to kill you or worse." The gravity of his words settled over Zara, but she didn't flinch. "I understand." They finished their meal and headed back to the horses. The men were no longer in front of the saloon, but as Zara and Hayes rode out of town, they spotted them mounting up as well. "Don't look back," Hayes instructed as they rode. "Act natural. Once we're over that ridge, we'll circle back and follow them." Zara did as he said, though every instinct told her to confront the murderers directly. They rode in silence until they crested the ridge, then veered off the main trail into a stand of trees. "Now we wait," Hayes said, dismounting and helping Zara down. They didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, the 3 men rode past, heading west toward the mountains. "That's not the way to my ranch," Zara observed. "No, but there are plenty of places to hide out in those hills. Come on, we need to keep a safe distance." They followed the men for nearly 2 hours, staying well back and using the terrain for cover. Eventually, The trio led them to a hidden valley where a camp was set up, several tents, a fire pit, and horses corralled with makeshift fencing. Hayes and Zara tied their horses out of sight and crept closer on foot, using the cover of boulders and scrub brush. From their vantage point, they could see at least 10 men in the camp. "That's them," Zara whispered, her heart pounding. "The tall one with the scar, he was the leader. He's the one who shot my father." Hayes put a steadying hand on her arm. "We've seen enough. Let's get back to town and fetch the sheriff." But as they turned to leave, Zara's foot dislodged a small rock, sending it tumbling down the slope. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to alert one of the men below. "Someone's up there," he shouted, drawing his gun. "Run," Hayes commanded, pulling Zara to her feet. They sprinted back toward their horses as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Hayes pushed Zara ahead of him, shielding her with his body. They reached the horses and mounted quickly, spurring the animals into a gallop. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit, hoofbeats, and shouting. Hayes led them on a winding path through the trees, using his knowledge of the terrain to throw off their pursuers. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the sounds of pursuit faded. Hayes signaled for them to slow down, the horses breathing hard from the exertion. "I think we lost them," he said, scanning the forest behind them. Zara nodded, too breathless to speak. The danger had been real, terrifyingly real. For the first time since her family's deaths, she felt the full weight of her vulnerability. "You're shaking," Hayes observed, moving his horse closer to hers. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice betrayed her. Hayes reached out and touched her cheek gently. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Zara." Something inside her broke at his words. The tears she'd been holding back for days spilled over, streaming down her face. She tried to wipe them away, embarrassed by the display of weakness. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. I can't." Hayes dismounted and helped her down from her horse, then pulled her into his arms. She stiffened at first, then surrendered to the comfort he offered, burying her face against his chest as the grief and fear overwhelmed her. "That's it," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Let it out. You've been carrying too much for too long." Zara cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned, all the while held securely in Hayes' strong arms. When the storm of emotion finally passed, she didn't pull away immediately, finding solace in his embrace. "I miss them so much," she whispered. "And I'm so afraid of failing them, of losing the ranch, of being alone." Hayes drew back slightly to look into her eyes. "You're not alone anymore, Zara. Not if you don't want to be." The tenderness in his gaze made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Hayes lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and Zara found herself responding, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as if to anchor herself to him. When they parted, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first day," he admitted. "Even with me pointing a shotgun at you?" Zara asked, a small smile finding its way to her lips. "Especially then," he replied, returning her smile. "You were the fiercest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." A twig snapped nearby, bringing them both back to the reality of their situation. "We need to move," Hayes said, helping Zara back onto her horse. "We'll head straight for the sheriff's office." They rode hard for Twin Pines, arriving as the sun was setting. Sheriff Miller was skeptical of their story at first, but the details Zara provided about the camp and the men convinced him to organize a posse. "You two stay here in town," he instructed. "Get a room at the hotel. I'll come find you when we return." Hayes nodded, placing a protective arm around Zara's shoulders. "We'll be waiting." The hotel had only one room available, a fact that would have scandalized Zara under normal circumstances. But after the events of the day, Propriety seemed less important than safety. "I'll sleep on the floor," Hayes assured her as they entered the modest room. Zara sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "What if they don't catch them?" she asked quietly. Hayes knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll figure out another way, but they will. Miller's a good sheriff, even if he's a bit slow to act sometimes. And then what? Even if they're caught, the bank won't loan me the money to rebuild. The ranch is still failing." "About that," Hayes said, reaching into his pocket, "I've been meaning to show you something." He pulled out a folded document and handed it to her. Zara opened it, confusion turning to surprise as she read. "This is a bank draft for a considerable sum," she said, looking up at him. "Where did you get this? Remember I told you I had savings for a claim? Well, there it is. I want you to use it to restock the herd." Zara stared at him in disbelief. "Hayes, I can't accept this. It's your future, your dream." "My dream has changed," he said simply. "I came to your ranch looking for work, but I found something worth far more." "You barely know me," Zara protested, though her heart was racing. "I know enough," Hayes replied. "I know you're brave and determined. I know you love that land and will fight for it with everything you have. I know you pretend to be stronger than you feel because you think showing emotion is weakness." He reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "And I know that, when you let those tears fall today, it was the strongest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Zara's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears of hope, of a future she hadn't dared imagine. "What are you saying, Hayes?" "I'm saying I love you, Zara Jenkins. I'm saying I want to build something with you, not just a ranch, but a life, a family." She drew in a shaky breath. "It's too soon." "Maybe," he acknowledged. "So we'll take it slow. Use the money to get the ranch back on its feet. I'll stay on as your foreman and we'll see where things lead. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people working together and getting to know each other better." Zara studied his face, seeing nothing but sincerity in his green eyes. Slowly she nodded. "All right, partners for now." Hayes smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. "Partners." The sheriff and his posse returned the next morning with good news. They had captured most of the Blackwater gang, including the leader. Better still, they had recovered some of the stolen goods, including, miraculously, Zara's mother's wedding ring. "Found it on the leader himself," Sheriff Miller said, handing the simple gold band to Zara. "Guess he thought it would bring him luck. Didn't work out too well for him," Hayes observed with satisfaction. They returned to the ranch that afternoon, riding side by side, the future stretching before them like the open Montana sky. Over the next few months, the ranch gradually came back to life. They used Hayes' money to buy new cattle and rebuild the main house. Word spread that the infamous Blackwater gang had been brought to justice, and the community rallied around Zara in a way they hadn't before. Even Mr. Patterson at the bank changed his tune, especially after Hayes formally proposed to Zara 6 months after their first meeting. The wedding was a small affair, held on the ranch with wildflowers decorating the new house and the entire town in attendance. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," Hayes whispered to Zara as they danced under the stars on their wedding night. "Strong or weak, laughing or crying, I love all of you." Zara smiled up at her husband, no longer hiding the emotions that shone in her eyes. "I know. That's why I can be truly strong now, because I don't have to carry it all alone." Hayes kissed her tenderly, then with growing passion. "You never will again," he promised. Years later, the Jenkins Montague Ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. They had 3 children who grew up hearing the story of how their father had seen past their mother's facade of strength to the vulnerability beneath, and had loved her all the more for it. And sometimes, When the day's work was done and they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zara would look at Hayes and marvel at how life could change in an instant, how one man's kindness had saved not just her ranch, but her heart. "What are you thinking about?" Hayes would ask, catching her gaze, and Zara, no longer afraid to show her feelings, would smile and tell him the truth. "How grateful I am that you saw my tears.